Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Mike Lander. Mike is the CEO of Piscari, a coaching firm that helps sell-side teams, yes, you heard that right, sell-side teams improve their negotiating skills, better understand procurement buyers, and ultimately arrive at better commercial deals. So Mike, welcome and thank you so much for being with me.
Kelly, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Not to put any pressure on you, but I think everybody is sitting a little bit closer to whatever device they're listening to this conversation on now. So before we dig in and really go sort of heavy on the sales perspective, what do you think it's helpful for people to know about your professional journey to this point?
So I think given that, the audience that's listening, people probably maybe traveling to work or traveling with their children to and from school, is in a nutshell, I'm an ex-buyer who now works with sellers. So I've spent, I don't know, on and off 20 odd years, maybe a bit more, working in the procurement world as a sourcing professional, as a procurement professional across indirect categories and some direct categories as well at some scale. And now I work with sellers. So the big part of the journey is I'm an ex-engineer. I'm very rational, very numbers oriented, logical, structured, like process. So procurement and sourcing for me were a perfect kind of fit. And then for various reasons, after like 20 odd years on that side of the fence, I decided, actually, I've done a lot of selling. I'm going to go and work with sellers and help sellers build better relationships and contracts with what they perceive as being the devil.
And so you're with us today as something of a translator. You're going to help us figure out, what does procurement think? What does sales think? Where is there overlap? Where are we all completely wrong?
Exactly.
And
did you ever listen to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, what's it? The Babelfish?
The Babelfish. So I could be called the Babelfish.
Excellent. The Babelfish of procurement and sales. You've just titled your episode.
I have. There we are.
I love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
It was
okay.
So good. It was.
I knew this was going to be good, but it's looking up really fast.
Good.
So here's where I want to start. And I'm going to remind you, Mike, to your own point about people listening in cars, this is a general rate show, right?
Yes.
Qualifier for this first question. What do salespeople honestly think of procurement?
There's a few things that spring to mind. They think they're only interested in price. They think they are the devil. They think that they're there to destroy deals and to disrupt a 9-month sales cycle. They think that they are barriers, obstacles, and that they're the process police.
And not being facetious in any way. Why do they think those things?
Because I think like any human being, we have a certain view of the world. We have filters. And as a salesperson, you're used to meeting your economic buyer. You're used to meeting IT or marketing or facilities or HR or whoever it is that you sell to, and you tune into their world. And of course, what happens is if you tune into your buyer's world, which is what you should do, when you come to meet sourcing and procurement folk, they have a different lens of the world. So imagine if it's like a filter that's got little grates in it.
Yeah.
The grate is lined up against your economic buyer and you can see clearly. When you turn around and look at procurement, the grate's closed. And therefore you're suspicious. Like any human being, you're wary, suspicious, distrustful, anxious, nervous, and therefore the fight or flight gene, I think, kicks in.
Yeah.
And most salespeople want to win. So they will either fight or they'll fly.
Yeah. Now, you've actually honed in on something really interesting that I haven't thought about in a while. And it's good to hear this from a sales perspective. So when procurement looks at, I don't know, let's say any sourcing project, right?
Yeah.
There's us and there's them. The us is procurement and everybody that works for procurement's company. The them are all the different suppliers.
But to your point, when each of those suppliers looks back at the company they hope they will get a contract with, the buyer and procurement don't necessarily have the same perspective, or they wouldn't think about each of those groups in the same way. So I think it's an interesting disconnect where it demonstrates to me the value of both sides starting to understand each other a little bit better.
Definitely.
Are there any downsides? Now, I'm going to be honest. I understand why sales thinks some of those things about some people in procurement. I'm not going to own all those downsides, but I have seen a lot of things so where it doesn't seem completely off base that some sales folks would not think great about procurement. Are there any downsides to sales holding those opinions? Is there a way in which this general stereotype actually not just holds procurement back by pigeonholing them, but could even hold sales back?
Definitely. I think it's whenever I talk to salespeople and they're in an RFP process, for example, I say two things. One, you're late to the party calling me, because by the time the RFP is issued,
Yeah.
a lot of work's been done already. Through good governance, nothing untoward's been done, but the groundwork's been prepared. And so you're entering the party very late. And the second thing I say to them is, go into this with an open mind. They're just another stakeholder, like any other stakeholder. They've got a different agenda. They've got different backgrounds. They're not the police. So what they say isn't the law. But there are governance laws, which they do abide by, and that you have to abide by in a process. And I say to them, ideally, what you want to be doing is you want to be building a relationship with procurement 18 months in advance of when you're ever going to bid for anything. And secondly, if you're talking to a stakeholder, an economic buyer that's got a budget, and you've got a solution to their problem that fits broadly within the budget, if the budget's over, pick a number, $100,000, say, my advice is very early in that cycle, the salespeople should be engaging with procurement and saying to their economic stakeholder, you know, Jane, in our experience, when we've worked on deals like this before, typically they're about a 9-month sales cycle for us to create the business case and make sure that the value is confirmed and to give you confidence in the decision. What we find is that if we engage procurement or sourcing teams late, they get blindsided and deals can go really badly wrong. Can I suggest we get sourcing involved now?
Yeah.
Because also that economic buyer may or may not have a good relationship with their sourcing counterpart.
That's true. Now, should procurement be trying to change the stereotype, or do you think we're better off leaving it in place and to your point about the police maybe doing good cop, bad cop, right? Is there a way to fix it? Should we fix it?
That's a very good question, Kelly. I think I've got two answers to that, I think. If you look back in time, I think we spoke about this before, kind of 20 years ago, and look where the profession came from.
Yeah.
And if you look at the direct sourcing angle of where it came from, particularly in CPG and in retail, when direct buyers were and still are extremely powerful, understandably, that created a relatively aggressive, competitive sourcing and procurement profession. I think there are still times when that's perfectly valid. If a salesperson allows themselves to be pigeonholed in the Kraljic matrix in the bottom left, which is you can't describe to the buyer how much value you create and how much impact you've got on their business, and you haven't convinced them that you're a scarce supply, therefore you are a commodity purchase, I would have no qualms with a sourcing and procurement professional being extremely assertive, very directive, driving savings and compliance and seeking innovation and carving out some differentiation and managing risk in a very assertive way. I've got no problem with that. I don't think that's bad practice at all.
Yeah. Now, you had said you had two ways. I want to make sure we hit both of them before I move on to my next question. Did you hit both of yours, or is there another way that you wanted to add in there?
I think if you look at that Kraljic matrix again and you go to the top right, I think the biggest thing that both parties can do is focus on the more strategic deals and build trust with each other and
Yeah.
take time. Trust takes time to build. And trust to me is a well-known equation by Meister et al. Trust is a combination of credibility and reliability and relationship building
Yeah.
divided by self-interest. So the more interested the salesperson is in themselves and less in sourcing and procurement, the lower the trust will be.
Yeah.
It takes time. So focus on high impact deals and focus on building trust and take your time.
And part of what that might require of either sales or procurement
Yeah.
is looking at the landscape and saying to the other party, you are not a strategic deal to me. Like,
Exactly.
sorry, I get that I'm strategic to you. We're two
Yeah.
very different companies, two very different organizations. You are not strategic to me. Maybe you're not commodity. You might not be in that bottom lower left square, but you also might not rise to the upper right. And so being honest and figuring that out actually gives everybody a valuable piece of information about how many resources, what do you put
Exactly.
into this deal? What do you offer to the other party to make it happen?
And I think it tells the seller, if they're really honest with themselves when they qualify the opportunity, if you see if you look at that kind of Kowalczyk matrix, I think it's a
Yeah.
really interesting, simple framework. If you took 10 deals for most sellers that are less educated with how sourcing works, 8 of their deals will be in the kind of bottom left-hand side and 1 or 2 deals on the top right. When you're
Okay.
qualifying a deal as a seller, I always say to them, you ought to be aiming for at least half and half. Half in the top right, half in the bottom left, because you won't always win out on the top being a strategic priority to your buyer. When you've recognized that, the way you approach the sales cycle, especially with sourcing and procurement people, for the bottom left is very different than the top right.
Mm,
Top right, you're going to try and collaborate. You're going to try and jointly problem solve. You're going to try and understand risk. You're going to do all those good things that we know people should do when they're building high value solutions. In the bottom left, you better make sure you're differentiated, truly differentiated. You
yeah.
better be crystal clear on the value that you're going to provide, and you better have a strong partner.
Yeah. Now, since we're talking about sort of the deal cycle and maybe ideal case, you have this very open conversation about what the deal means to both sides. A lot of times that's not going to happen, either because the sides aren't comfortable being honest or because there simply isn't time to have the conversation.
Yeah.
Is there anything that procurement can infer about how the supplier views their organization based on how a sales rep or a sales team treats them?
That's a good question. Just unpack that for me a little bit more, Kelly. Just
Sure.
dig into that a little bit more before I give an answer.
Yeah. And I'll give you like the super basic. If you can't get the supplier to respond to your email, to call you back, you're not strategic to them, right?
Yep.
Because salespeople are incentivized to keep customers happy, leverage the deal up into something bigger. If you can't, I mean, if we tried to make a Kowalczyk alternative that's like from the sales perspective,
Yep.
if you're in procurement, you can't get your sales rep to call you back, email you back, you're in the bottom right-hand corner. You don't really need them to tell you that. If you can't get sales to call you back, you are not strategic. Are
Exactly.
there other examples like that where we might be able to understand on some sort of continuum of importance, from commodity, from a customer standpoint, all the way up to like, you're the deal that this year is going to decide if we put in a pool or not at home, relative importance. What might we be trying to read from the dynamic between our team and that salesperson?
So I think, and we'll take this from the buyer's side, yeah?
Sure.
From the sourcing professional. I think you made a very interesting point in our previous discussion as well about sourcing and procurement are a bit wary of salespeople because they think A, they're trying to sell, and B,
Yeah.
they're trying to hide things because they don't want the whole picture to come out. It's not always true. It is sometimes true.
Yeah.
So I think as a sourcing professional, if I go back to kind of what I was doing and looking at certain deals, some of the best deals I did was with niche suppliers where we were a biggish company, not huge, but say 300-400 million turnover.
Yeah.
And our spend was, say, I don't know, 30 million on indirects. And we'd be looking at a particular category and it's a 500,000 spend in a particular category with one supplier. I'd be looking for well-established niche suppliers because then I know we've kind of both got skin in the game. We've both got something to win
Yeah.
and lose. It's a bit more balanced. So when I was then looking at the supply side and going, well, who should I work with? if I picked a company, let's say we had that kind of like it's $500,000 to spend. If I picked a supplier whose turnover was $1 billion, my chance of getting on their radar is quite slim.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that. And I knew that the salesperson would have very strict qualification criteria. They'd have a system internally. They'd be passing it through. And they'd treat me as a, okay, I mean, $500,000 is not to be sniffed at, but it's not going to move the dial for them. Whereas if I went to an established niche supplier where $500,000 is, say, 5% of their total revenue, I get loads of attention.
Yeah.
I get loved to death. So I think it's really important when sourcing are looking at the kind of supply side, and this is it is bread and butter, Kelly, but I think it's worth reminding people, is that, it is horses for courses. You've got to pick the right profile of supplier, and that's media profile, that's financial profile, that's risk profile. And also, if they're VC backed, or PE backed, again, it's another trigger sign. You're saying they're in growth mode. For example, if they're private equity backed, let's say they're 100 million turnover, they're private equity backed. They've got and they've just recently been financed. They've got to double in size in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
They care more about their EBITDA normally and revenue growth than they do about CapEx. So you can start to think about constructive commercial deals that you could propose to the supplier that is beneficial to them and is beneficial to you.
Yeah.
And that's when I think you can build trust, you can build value, because you understand where they're coming from. That's what I would do. And that's what I used to do.
And I think that's really useful, because if relative size and understanding where the company is in their growth cycle, thinking about the supplier, are two really good inputs to procurement, figuring out what this relationship is going to be. I mean, it's harder in the case of a private company, but you can still sort of back into that and figure it out. That piece of information gives you a pretty good sense of, to your point, how much love are you going to get out of this situation? Is it going to be the cold shoulder, or is it going to be all warm and lovey-dovey? Depending on what you're going for in that category of spend, that is a terrific thing for procurement to look at.
I think so. It should be part of the kind of qualification framework that procurement look at when they're looking at their supply base. Same when you're doing if you're going through an efficiency drive, if you've got, if the category's not been touched for a while, we all know what we do. We look at the spend cube and then we go, okay, what's the tail like? You've got 1 or 2 big suppliers. You've got a very long tail of small suppliers. I'm going to consolidate this. When you start looking at that, then you start working out, maybe I don't want to give the tail to my dominant big supplier, because now I'm overexposed. Now that's a bad idea. But what about that 3rd or 4th level supplier that's only getting a very small piece of the pie, but is of a decent size? They could absorb more. They could manage our tail spend, and we won't bowl them over. I used to get very worried about suppliers who were established with weak balance sheets.
Okay.
Because I'm like, we do a $500,000 deal with you, and we pay on 90, 120 days, and you've got startup costs.
Yeah.
You could be in for $100,000 easily of working capital. If your balance sheet is weak, we could knock you over.
Yeah. Now, we've talked a lot of us and them today, and I want to finish in a happy place. So based on your knowledge of both sides, what is it that sales and procurement either have in common that they should focus on, or where is some common ground where both sides can genuinely win in these deals?
So I would always start with value. I think the biggest mistake that salespeople make is when they don't understand the value they deliver to their clients. Yeah. So where the common ground is, sourcing and procurement people and salespeople want the same thing in terms of driving value into the organization on both sides. So I'd start with value.
Yeah.
Then I'd look at the relative return. If the buyer's getting a 10-to-1 return on that investment, that's a great deal, potentially. Yeah. And if it's going to generate an extra 5%, 10% of sales growth for the supplier, that's also a great deal and go a long way to meeting quota. I'd then look at risk. and I'd say, have we got aligned views on risk?
Yeah, that's a big one.
It's huge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because as a buyer, if my alarm bells start ringing about operational risk and financial risk and
Information
reputational risk,
security. Yep.
information security risk, all those, and the supplier's blindsided to that and going, I don't care about all that. I can see the money.
Yeah.
That's clearly never going to work. So I think looking at value, looking at risk, and the last thing I'd say is the common thing is alignment of objectives. Whenever I started negotiating or I help suppliers negotiate with sourcing people, I've got a little template that I've developed to help sellers. And the opening thing in the prep stage is, are your objectives aligned? And they're like, what do you mean? Our objective is to do a deal. And I'm like, nah, that's a naive objective.
Yeah. Let's dig deeper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go a little bit deeper than that. What do we think our sourcing colleague and the buy side, what are their objectives and what are ours? If you just write down 3 objectives and you look for alignment, yes or no, if you've got 2 out of 3 misaligned, your chances of doing a deal are very slim.
Yeah.
And it's a simple thing to do. And I see hardly any salespeople doing it.
And even if you do manage to do the deal, the chances that everyone will think it's a success 8, 12, 18 months after it was signed are almost zero.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question, Kelly.
You're going to flip the tables on me,
absolutely,
Mike. Okay.
Definitely. In all of you've got a huge amount of experience in sourcing. You've interviewed loads of people on this amazing podcast. What do you think are the kind of 1 or 2 big things that you'd say to salespeople? So when I promote this to my audience, I can say, listen to what Kelly's got to say. What do you think it is that frustrates sourcing and procurement professionals?
I think the big thing is there's perception on both sides, and everybody's trying to be, I'll do air quotes, this is bad practice for audio, but air quotes, strategic. And what it really boils down to in most cases is like head games.
Right.
I feel like, you just listed out, let's say 4 forms of risk, right? If both sides of each deal are going to adequately manage all those kinds of risk and also trust that the person they're doing the deal with has their back in all of those dimensions, you can't start the relationship based on a head game.
Exactly.
And so I would genuinely say you have to do your homework. You have to know what you're negotiating for, the value you're hoping to get through the deal. But if you can't communicate openly with the person on the other side of the deal, and it doesn't matter what role you're being in that conversation, there's no way it's ever going to be successful. But if you can find a team or a person that you click with, where you say, look, this wasn't part of my plan, but now I'm thinking maybe I should ask you questions about this. That's where the opportunity starts to get created. Comes back to trust, comes back to openness, comes back to transparency. And just as human beings, we have to talk this stuff through. And I think same as for procurement, same as for sales, we all just need to be a little bit less head gamey. We need to be a little bit more honest, not sharing the things that understandably can't be shared, but we need to come to that table, virtual, physical, with a little bit more goodwill than maybe we have in the past.
That's a very good practical piece of advice. I spoke to a guy called Kwame Kristen a while ago, who's a negotiation expert. And he talked about a really, again, simple idea, but very powerful, which was about the amygdala in the brain. If you walk into a negotiation and your counterparty's amygdala is basically firing, so you're very emotional. Yeah. You can't negotiate a sensible, structured deal when your counterparty is emotional. So we said, job 1, just calm that amygdala down. Yeah. Just take the emotion out the air. I'm thinking of one guy I used to work with who's an amazing sales director, a guy called Malcolm. And he had a way of calming things down, not getting excited, calming things down, asking questions, just waiting until it had all settled, and then getting into kind of, where are we? What are your objectives? Here are our objectives. Where are we trying to get to? Yeah. That to me is a very evolved way of engaging in a negotiation.
Yeah. My own personal approach, still to this day, anybody I negotiate with, stop listening to this part. My approach is always can you help me understand? Right?
Yeah.
Because I know myself, I'm not the bang the shoe on the desk person. I'm not the like yell and threaten and be theatrical person. But I find that if you can get someone talking, it has to be a real question. It can't be like,
Yeah.
oh, gee, can you help me understand how this works? It has to be
Exactly.
like legit, but come with a question. I'm like,
Yeah.
hey, can you help me understand how we arrived at this point? Why is this so hard? How could I improve this internal process? You start the dialogue from a place of mutual respect where nobody is trying to leverage themselves over the other. And I
Yes.
think it has a way of setting a good tone for like, let's therefore fix this together. Most human beings respond to that as different as we all are.
They do. I think joint problem solving. I'm a fan of what Einstein said about, if I had a problem to solve in an hour, you'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem. And often what I find it a lot, is that
Yeah.
sellers, when talking to sourcing and procurement professionals, they're trying to solve the wrong problem.
Yeah.
They're focused purely on discount. So they say, right, they've asked for a 20% discount. I can't give them that. I'm going to give them 3%. And then they'll move to like 50. I'm like, stop.
Yeah.
But you're trying to solve the wrong problem. And I remember being a buyer, and some sellers would yield to this. Let's take a scenario, Kelly. It's very simple. I'm selling to you, and it's $100,000 deal, and we're 3/4 of the way down the line, and you turn around and go, I think I can do a deal, Mike, but I need 20% off. So 80,000, not 100,000. If I say to you, I can't do 20% off, but I'll do 10% off, what I've signaled to you, I believe, is, and I'll check in a second, is I don't value my product or service very much. And I've got a threshold I've been given by my sales director, and I'll see how far I can push it. So you're going to go, well, it's a bit of a game now.
Right.
Okay. So you've knocked 10 grand off. Well, how about 17?
Yeah.
And it's just a back and forth.
It's just a numbers game at that
It's
point.
just a numbers game.
Yeah.
The problem statement is, and I train my sellers to say, pause and go, what problem are you trying to solve here, Kelly? And the sourcing professional goes, well, I want a cheaper price. Can I get into that a bit more? When you say cheaper price, is there a problem with scope versus price? Is there a problem versus value versus price? Is there a problem that your budgets have been constrained? What's the problem we're trying to solve here? Now, if you say, I just need a discount, I say to sellers, just say to them, we don't do discounts. I'll trade you something for sure.
Yeah.
But we don't do discounts. And to me, having that simple, honest conversation, if the sourcing person still says, I just need 20% off, I would say close your books, thank them for their time, apologize for any wasted time, and leave politely.
Yeah.
What's your view?
I totally agree. And in a case like that, I always go back to scope, right? Okay, maybe you don't have the 100 grand I was hoping to get. Clearly, you're somewhere in the 80 grand range. Here's what I feel like I can give you for 80 grand. So I'm going to change the scope to match what I'm reading your budget is.
Absolutely fine. I'm writing a proposal right now. That's precisely what I'm doing. I'm giving some options. Again, a message to sellers. When you talk to sourcing and procurement professionals, in my view, give them options.
Yeah.
Don't give them, if you give a human being one road and they don't like that road, it isn't going to work.
Yeah.
Give them
it's a
three
yes,
options.
no question.
Yeah, don't give them a binary. Give them some options to play with.
Yeah.
I'm not saying menu price. I'm saying give options. And then start trading.
Yeah. Now, Mike, as we start to bookend our hitchhiker's guide here to sales and procurement.
How did the bagel fish go, by the way? Was it a good analogy?
I thought it was a good analogy. I thought we did well. I think you do very well going back and forth in your own mind, right? Like you can see it this way and then you can see it that way. Not to make it good and bad, but it's like the angel and devil on the shoulder, right? You can hear the sales and the procurement in your head at the same time. Hopefully they're not arguing.
Nope.
But every person that comes on this show, the first time we take them through this exercise. So I'm going to give you two questions. You can pick either one and there's no wrong answers.
Okay.
So either what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or what do you think heroism looks like in a business context?
I'll answer the first because I
Okay.
think I've got more of an answer. They're not more important. It's just more of an answer.
Sure.
I think a sourcing hero looks like a sourcing professional that genuinely understands how to create value for their business and for the supplier's business. No one wants to buy services from a supplier who's on their knees and making no money. It's just bad business. So a hero looks like an eye on their own value, an eye on supplier value.
Yeah. Now, Mike, if people are meeting you for the first time in this conversation and they'd like to borrow your Babelfish to learn a
Yep.
little bit more about how the other side functions, what is the best way for them to get in touch and connect with you?
LinkedIn's very easy. So go onto my LinkedIn profile, Mike Lander on LinkedIn. Or you can email me, mike@piscari.com.
Excellent. Mike, thank you so much for your time today.
I've loved it, Kelly. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well and always remember that you can be a hero too.